Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This episode is the third and final instalment in our series, Cameron's Referendums. And we're looking at the vote that took place a decade ago, the Brexit referendum, which I would say undoubtedly shaped more about what happened in the following years in British politics than any other event, with the only potential rival of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think it's also, of the three referendums that we've discussed, the one that becomes the most consequential, if only for the reason that it's the only one where the public votes for change, and it's the only one where the government, at least the main governing party of the United Kingdom, doesn't get what it wants. So Richard, to kick us off, why don't you set the scene somewhat about what Britain's place in the EU was like in the lead up to the referendum?
Well, after the vote to leave the EU, there were all kinds of pieces written about what was the reason why Britain voted to leave the EU. And I have to say, I got my fair share of them from my students. I became a lecturer in 2017, the year after the Brexit vote. A number of years after that, I got many students who wanted to write the dissertations on that. There are 1,000 different reasons why Britain voted to leave the EU, but I think a necessary factor for Britain's departure from the EU was a set of events that took place in the early 2000s, which was the agreement by the Blair government to accept the expansion of the EU into some of the former Eastern Bloc countries, without placing transitional controls on immigration, but frankly also just accepting the growth of the EU to states that were clearly much more economically underdeveloped than the UK at the time. Now, obviously, many of these countries have had very successful growth, and part of that, some people would argue, is because of their membership of the EU. But at the time, the situation of wages and employment was much worse in those Eastern European countries than in countries like the United Kingdom and other Western European countries. And so what that meant was countries like Britain became very attractive for Eastern European immigration. The government at the time was completely unprepared for this. The government was advised by a number of individuals, but one individual, Christian Dussman, professor of economics at UCL, who told the Home Office that just 26,000 migrants would come to Britain from the new EU member states in the first 2 years. It ended up being about 500,000 in just the first 2 years. In the years after that, the levels of immigration into Britain changed in a profound way. This meant that by the time of the Brexit vote, attitudes about immigration and attitudes about voting in the EU referendum became quite closely aligned. In other words, if you were opposed to these high levels of immigration, you were more likely to vote to leave. And ever since that Brexit vote, it's always been presumed that if you are Eurosceptic, you are anti-immigration. But actually, that is quite a short memory view of immigration in the EU. It wasn't always the case that people who were skeptical of immigration were also skeptical of our membership in the EU. In fact, there's some research to suggest that the people who were most skeptical about immigration in 1975 voted for Britain to remain in the European Economic Community as it was at the time, basically because they saw Europe as a smaller group of migrants coming to the UK. They also saw it as a whiter group of migrants. That's why you had white supremacists like Oswald Mosley advocating remaining in the EEC in 1975. And if anything, the people who were more pro-immigration, particularly from the Commonwealth, tended to be Eurosceptics in the 1970s. But certainly by 2016, skepticism about immigration and skepticism about membership of the EU were very closely aligned. And I think more than anything else, that was the most potent fact of being in the EU, because it taught the British people that no matter how they voted in an election, that issue was not going to change, because membership of the EU says that you will agree to free movement of people across the EU. That is built into the treaties. That's not something that EU parliamentary elections have nothing to do with any of this. It's a fundamental aspect of membership. And the only way it could change is if every single member of the EU agreed to change the EU treaties to take out freedom of movement, which was not going to happen. For me, it made real to the British public a reality that people like me, who are more kind of economic socialists who objected to the EU, which we already knew, which is that there are just certain things you cannot do as a national government while you're in the EU. So immigration, sovereignty, and Euroscepticism came together in a really potent way in the lead up to the referendum.
Two key bits of context to this. So one of them is that in the 2010 general election, David Cameron pledged to get net migration down to the tens of thousands, so a sub 100,000 figure. But that's not what was happening. In fact, it was going up. So in 2012, the net migration figures, this is EU and non-EU, by the way, not just from the European Union, but the net migration figures in 2012 were 177,000 more coming into the country than leaving it. In 2013, 209,000, and in 2014, 318,000. So you've really got this growing number of people coming to the UK, in spite of what governments say they will do, and in spite of what the public say they want governments to do. This is, I think, inevitably a factor in the decision to hold a referendum, which is one that David Cameron makes during his time as Prime Minister. So quite famously, the Lib Dems had said before 2010 that they would have an in-out referendum on Europe, but it wasn't Conservative policy until early 2013. And part of the story of how we get there actually involves a really consequential rebellion in October of 2011. This was when an MP who's not that well remembered now, I think it's fair to say, called David Nuttall, who represented Bury North in Greater Manchester. And he was behind a move in Parliament to have a referendum on Europe that attracted 81 Conservative MPs to vote for it, in spite of a three-line whip being put on them to vote against it. It was the biggest rebellion on a European issue in the entire time that Britain has been in Europe. To put it into some context, the worst rebellion that John Major suffered over the Maastricht Treaty was when 41 MPs defied the whip in 1993. So this is a very significant rebellion in the context of actually a very intensive whipping operation as well. I remember talking to an MP who, I think you won't mind me saying, was not in the upper ranks of the parliamentary party, but who was called in to see George Osborne and basically told that he should not support this amendment. Went on to support the amendment anyway, so that narrows it down somewhat. So that becomes, for me anyway, probably the key turning point in the lead up to the referendum, when there is a critical mass of Conservative MPs who want to have the referendum and are willing to force the issue, even against severe pressure from the party leadership.
And what you have also in the background to all of this is the Eurozone crisis, which is taking place in the Eurozone countries. Britain was one of the few member states that was given an opt-out from joining the euro, and very importantly and fatefully, the new Labour government, after playing with the idea, decided not to go forward with joining the single currency, which I think is one of the most consequential policy legacies of the Blair government, even though I don't know if they would claim it to be. But what the Eurozone crisis was entailing was that countries that had what was seen to be less efficient economies were struggling to operate within this monetary union, which required them basically to be more efficient or to struggle with an overvalued currency in their country. This was basically what Britain experienced in the major years, 1992 with Black Wednesday, with the pound trying to keep up with the German Deutschmark, was overvalued, and our economy was really struggling to maintain that value. The economically strongest states, Germany in particular, want to amend the governing framework of the European Union to impose tighter fiscal rules on national governments to try to force EU countries to be more, in their view, economically efficient in order to deal with this Eurozone crisis. By the way, I should say that this is something that should deeply alarm socialists and people who believe in governments being able to plot alternative economic futures from neoliberalism. David Cameron goes to the summit in December of 2011 and vetoes this treaty change. Now, Cameron doesn't do it because Cameron's a socialist. Cameron does this for sovereignty reasons, basically, and I think also for political reasons to try to show that he's standing up to the EU. And what does the EU do? But it goes behind Cameron's back, and it basically agrees to impose these rules at the Eurozone level. They call it their Fiscal Compact Treaty. And this, I think, was quite alarming for those of us who were Eurosceptic, but at the time were not really contemplating Britain leaving the EU, but thought that the thing you do is you just fight for sovereignty as much as you can from within the EU. Here you have the national veto basically being made a mockery of. Okay, the fiscal rules didn't apply to Britain because we weren't in the Eurozone, but if we ever found ourselves in the Eurozone, then basically the ability of British governments to set budgets would be enormously constrained by the rules of this supranational body. And it was really, I think, very alarming.
I can see why you describe that as alarming, but the thing that I really take from that is that Cameron is actually a very Eurosceptic Prime Minister. He's actually probably the most Eurosceptic Prime Minister the country had in terms of what they believed when they were in office about the European Union. Nobody else had...
Not Attlee.
Well, since we joined, because nobody else had vetoed a European treaty like this. Like you say, they then did what they wanted to do without Britain being part of it, but that had not happened before. The other thing that is worth mentioning to boost David Cameron's credentials as a Eurosceptic is that in 2011, the government had passed a referendum lock into legislation, which was to say that no more powers would go from the United Kingdom to the European Union without there being a referendum on them. There hadn't been a referendum on Maastricht or Nice or Lisbon or any of the or the Single European Act or any of the treaties beforehand, and Cameron put it on statute. Of course, governments can always ignore provisions like that if they wish, but it was legislated for, and I think in practice very difficult to wiggle out of, that before there was any further treaty change that would consolidate power in Europe, there'd be a referendum. So I say that just to really put into context that it's easy to think with hindsight of Cameron, the great Europhile, but actually I think of him as a very Eurosceptic Prime Minister, at least in the context of the fact that I would argue confidently that between 1973 and 2016, no occupant of number 10 Downing Street would have been Eurosceptic to the point of advocating for Brexit. I don't think that would have happened under any premiership. But Cameron was about as Eurosceptic as British premierships got.
I will put in a plea for Jim Callaghan. He ended up delaying the EU parliamentary elections by a year because he didn't believe in the principle of an elected EU parliament, because it gave the EU or the EC a veneer of democratic legitimacy, which he saw basically as window dressing, and it was undeserved. But I take your point. In this context, you have, at that point, historically high levels of immigration coming in particular from poorer Eastern European countries. No criticism of people who undertake the rules of the system in which they're operating under and move for reasons of a better life. I don't blame the people who moved. That's the system as it operated. But it was not popular with a significant segment of the British public. They were voting repeatedly in elections to bring down immigration. And he basically had no way of delivering that while we're in the EU. And you have the EU further integrating through this fiscal compact. Okay, Britain is not part of it, but this is moving to further integration without Cameron having his referendum because of this weird thing of Britain in the two-speed Europe thing that's developing. And in May of 2012, so we're told, Cameron meets with some of his closest advisors, William Hague, Ed Llewellyn. They're actually on a trip to America. They've been to a NATO summit. They're at a pizza restaurant at Chicago O'Hare. If anyone knows which restaurant this might be, let us know. And over their slices of pizza, Cameron and his advisors agreed that it would be a good idea for Cameron to propose an in-out referendum on EU membership. Not that he would deliver it in that parliament, but that it would be something that would be put in the next Conservative manifesto.
There's then about a 6-month or so pause before that being informally agreed. behind the scenes and being announced as Conservative policy. But it all leads up to the Bloomberg speech of January 2013, so named because it took place at Bloomberg's HQ in London. And in that speech, Cameron does a few things. First of all, he sets out that there will be a referendum on Europe, and it will be an in-out referendum. So there will be a choice of whether to stay or whether to go. And in part he does that because there is a mood among some of his aides that UKIP is on the rise. This is the UK Independence Party, led by one Nigel Farage. They're doing fairly well in the polls. They overtake the Liberal Democrats around this time. Nothing like the success that Farage is enjoying with Reform UK. We're talking about 10, 11% in the polls, but it's enough to panic the Conservatives that if a big chunk of that is coming up from their vote share, then it could cost them the next election. There is also an acknowledgement that one of the last big electoral tests before the next general election, which at this time is set for 2015 because of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, is going to be the European elections in 2014. And these are elections that UKIP is very well positioned to do well in. In fact, UKIP ultimately wins those elections. That's the first time in pretty much a century that a national election has been won by a party that isn't Labour or the Conservatives. So it ends up being a very dramatic thing in 2014. And recognising that might happen, some of Cameron's aides say, well, we think there might be a leadership challenge if you don't make this pledge before then. Because that's where some of the mood on the right of politics is moving, and a big chunk of our MPs are a part of that. And so Cameron announces this referendum. He also announces that before it happens, he will try and negotiate a new settlement for Britain in Europe. And he says, quote, "When we have negotiated that new settlement, we will give the British people a referendum with a very simple in or out choice, to stay in the EU on these new terms or to come out altogether. And if a Conservative government is elected, we will introduce the enabling legislation immediately and pass it by the end of that year. And we will complete this negotiation and hold this referendum within the first half of the next Parliament."
And so some cynics would say that Cameron proposed the referendum to save his own bacon as part of Conservative Party management, that he was worried that he'd get, as Lee has said, a Eurosceptic challenger before the next general election. And the double level of cynicism is that Cameron promised this thinking it would save him, but he would never actually have to implement it. Because in those years that we're talking about, 2011, 12, 13, 14, in most of the polls, Labour's ahead. The expectation, and certainly it was my very misplaced expectation at the time, was that there was going to be a Labour government elected in 2015. At best, one might think there'd be a hung parliament, and if Cameron had any hope of staying in government, he'd have to do another deal with the Lib Dems. Unlikely. But if he was going to go into government with the Lib Dems were going to say to him, you've got to drop that pledge. So in other words, the only way that Cameron would have to deliver on this promise was if the Conservatives won an overall majority at the 2015 election, which very few people thought would happen. But then it did.
I should say, I don't really buy this idea that Cameron thought he would just negotiate it away. Well, maybe he thought he might. I can't say what was going on in the back of his mind. But I don't think it actually would have been a practical strategy, partly because he had identified this referendum as a red line in any future coalition negotiations. But actually more so because if you imagine what the parliamentary arithmetic would have had to look like for there to be a Conservative Lib Dem coalition in 2015. Now let's remember that the Lib Dems got battered in that election. They went down to 8 MPs. By the way, they got battered as part of a conscious Conservative strategy that David Cameron signed off on to very heavily target Lib Dem constituencies, lots of which flipped Conservative. So if there was to be the parliamentary numbers to have a Conservative Lib Dem coalition, even if the Lib Dems survived rather better than they did, you may have had, 20 Lib Dem MPs who would have been topping up 310 maybe Conservative MPs. And now we know from when there was roughly that many Tory MPs in the last Parliament, 81 of them would rebel against their own government, 3-line whip, in order to try and vote for a referendum on Europe. In that context, when actually rebelling against the government's coalition agreement would be to be standing up for your own party's manifesto. I think there would not only be more than 81 Conservative MPs who were willing to coin a phrase, die in a ditch over the referendum question. I think they would have been significantly more powerful than however many Lib Dem MPs there were to top the numbers up. So I don't think it would have been a viable strategy to trade it away. And just as in the 2010 to 15 Parliament, Cameron did use the Lib Dem MPs to try and tame some of his own backbenchers and say, well, look, I can't do that because we can't agree with the Lib Dems. I think the opposite could have been true as well, that when you had particularly boisterous Tory MPs, it could have been the case that they asserted their pressure quite effectively, and Cameron may have had to go to the Lib Dems and basically confront them with what some in his party were demanding that he do.
But I think you're slightly missing the point here. I think Cameron felt he could offer this because he thought he wasn't going to be going back into government, because he thought that even if there was a hung parliament, the Lib Dems were not going to go into government with the Conservatives after the thrashing that they had had. So it was easy for him to say this is a red line in any coalition negotiation agreement, because he was never expecting any coalition negotiation agreement, except perhaps with the DUP or something, but certainly with the Lib Dems, actually to result in another Lib Dem Conservative coalition. But perhaps I'm speculating a bit too far there.
Anyway, all of that was a rather moot point, because in 2015, the Conservatives did win a majority. I remember hearing David Cameron do a conference speech not long afterwards, in which he described the two words that cheer him up perhaps more than any other: exit poll. The exit poll had predicted a big Conservative win, and then the win was actually even better than that still. And so Cameron was good to hear his promise and introduced legislation to have a referendum just as he had described, and did it very quickly into the Parliament with the European Referendum Act 2015.
Yes, so Cameron did move very quickly on this. He had promised that he would deliver a referendum before the midway point of that Parliament. In a sense, I think he wanted to get it out of the way. Actually, if we think back to the 1975 European referendum under Harold Wilson, Wilson took a similar view. Labour wins its majority in October of 1974, and pretty soon after that, in the winter of 1974 to 5, the government is engaging in its negotiations with the EEC to get better terms for Britain, with the referendum date of June of 1975. So actually, Wilson moves even more quickly than Cameron, you might argue, although Wilson had first come into government in March of 74, but in a minority. Anyway, so the referendum bill is going through Parliament very quickly. On the second reading of the bill, which is the important vote on the principle of the referendum, 544 MPs vote in favour, just 53 vote against. And the only party to vote against the referendum is the SNP. Now, this is actually quite interesting, because when Ed Miliband had been leader of the opposition, at the time when Cameron was making all these promises about holding a referendum, Labour was firmly against the idea, and Miliband refused to support a referendum. This was controversial. We now know behind the scenes in Labour, Ed Balls, the Shadow Chancellor, wanted Labour to support a referendum. Although I'm not in favour of the principle of referendums as an active electoral strategy, I think Balls was probably correct. I have seen some analyses that suggest that Labour could have deprived the Conservatives of their majority had Labour had an in-out EU referendum in its manifesto. Ed Miliband, of course, in my view, very irresponsibly cut and run after his election defeat. He resigned immediately as leader. He didn't even say, I will wait until my successor is elected before I go. He just went there and then. Really not something that Labour leaders do. The one exception is Gordon Brown, but that was very different. That was in the context of Brown trying to put together a deal that the Lib Dems would accept, and Brown very nobly was willing to sacrifice himself for a Labour government. Miliband just did it out of pure self-indulgence, as far as I can see. So the person who makes this really consequential decision is the acting Labour leader, Harriet Harman, who decides, of course, with the shadow cabinet, that Labour will support the principle of an in-out referendum on Europe. And I think this is one of those really interesting moments in this journey, which I think is very often under-discussed. What if Harriet Harman had maintained Ed Miliband's principled opposition to an EU referendum? How might that have changed Labour's positioning, maybe not at the time of the referendum, but perhaps subsequently, where Labour could say, well, we actually never wanted the referendum to happen. Labour couldn't say that because Harriet Harman had whipped the Labour MPs to vote in favour of the referendum.
My sympathy with Harman's position is that opposing a referendum is in some respects an awkward thing to do politically, because what are you opposing if you object to a referendum? Well, you're opposing giving the people their say. It's the most direct form of democracy that you can have, to ask the whole mass of voters to turn out and decide, rather than just leaving it to their representatives in Parliament. So I think it can be difficult, really, to argue against a referendum, particularly in that context where actually we're talking about one that's going to be delivered by a party that had it in the manifesto and won a majority in the election. Although it is interesting that what would become the most divisive and controversial issue in British politics over this period, the legal mechanism to bring it about, is staggeringly uncontroversial. The question itself that will be put in the referendum is decided by the Electoral Commission, who are tasked with basically overseeing democracy in Britain from a technocratic view to make sure that it's fair. And the question that they propose is, should the United Kingdom remain a member of the European Union or leave the European Union? And that gives us the two terms, remain and leave, that of course have become associated with this question ever since. And also the two tribes that for many people they became associated with, remainers and leavers, with all the connotations that means good and bad and indifferent and in between. What's quite curious about the question is that most referendums ask yes or no questions. So they give a proposition and they say yes to this proposition or no to this proposition. That's what it was in 1975. Rob Saunders' great book about their referendum is called Yes to Europe, because people were putting their cross next to yes. The Scottish independence referendum we talked about last time is, should it be an independent country? Yes, no. The AV referendum? Yes, no. So this use of remain, leave, I think is really interesting. And so it invites the hypothetical question. Well, what else might it have been to have a yes or no vote? It could have been, should the United Kingdom leave the European Union, which is very often the way these things are framed. It sets out the change, and then you're invited to say yes or no, and yes would be to implement the change, and no would be to oppose the change. That's what it was in our last two episodes and last two referendums. Or I suppose it could have been, should the United Kingdom remain in the European Union, yes or no? I don't really know how much of a difference it would have made to the outcome or to the way in which the whole thing was framed. But certainly it gave us these monikers for the way in which people would vote and very much how they would see each other afterwards.
Well, we of course had a precedent for this because we'd already had an in-out referendum on European membership back in 75. And the ballot there, I think some Eurosceptics really argued, was quite leading in favour of the pro-Remain side as we would come to see it today. So this is what the ballot said. It first had a preamble. It said, "The government has announced the results of the renegotiation of the United Kingdom's terms of membership of the European Community. Do you think the United Kingdom should stay in the European Community, the common market?" So obviously it primes people to think, oh, we're actually voting for a renegotiated new terms. It's a Labour government, which is known to be a more Eurosceptic party, that's negotiated these new terms. And shall we stay in this arrangement? All kind of feels like it's priming you for a yes rather than a no vote. Ultimately, I'm not sure these really make a huge difference, the wording of questions, except on the margins. And so if it's a close vote, obviously it wasn't close in 75, it was close in 2016, might make a bit of a difference on the margins. But I think most people go in and are motivated for one side or the other, irrespective of the vocabulary of the ballot. But it is, of course, telling that these terms remain and leave, as you said, Lee, become the tribes. And the Electoral Commission's decision to use those terms are really important because the campaigns themselves model themselves on those terms, particularly the campaign group Vote Leave, whose Chief Executive Matthew Elliott, we've interviewed in a separate podcast episode, he waited until the Electoral Commission declared the vocabulary of the question, and then he said, we used leave because that was the term that was going to be on the ballot. So there are lots of interesting parallels between the 2016 referendum and the 1975 referendums, and one of them is what I've already just mentioned, which is the decision of the pro-Remain or stay inside to go to Brussels to try to renegotiate Britain's terms of membership in a more sovereigntist rather than EU integrationist perspective. And in 1975, Harold Wilson sent the Foreign Secretary, Jim Callaghan, to make these negotiations. And I think that was quite a canny move because Callaghan was, I think really in his heart, was a Eurosceptic. He certainly was very anti-EEC when Labour was in opposition in the 1970s. So one example is a terrific speech that Callaghan gave, I think, in Southampton in 1971, where he argues against Britain joining the European Economic Community because he says, although we're being told at the moment it's just going to be a trading bloc, that over time this is a political project that's baked into the existing treaty and it could lead to another treaty which further integrates. And of course, Callaghan was absolutely right. That's exactly what has happened with the Maastricht Treaty and the Lisbon Treaty and so on. And Callaghan says, quote, under such a treaty, the national veto would of course disappear. Think of the situation then. It will be no use British electors coming to the candidates for a Westminster Parliament and complaining about prices or unemployment. Those candidates will reply that it has nothing to do with them. They would have no more control over these matters than does the present Hampshire County Council. Take it up with the European Parliament, they will say, and the best of British luck, because our representatives are in a permanent minority there. So for Wilson to take someone who was known to be saying non, merci beaucoup, as he famously said, to the EEC in opposition, to then say, okay, well, he's going to get better terms for us and then campaign to stay in, that was meant to reassure some of the Eurosceptics. Cameron led the negotiations for Britain. I can understand why Cameron, of course, did that because he wanted to show how seriously he was taking this and he wanted to, as the leader of the country, put the most pressure that he felt he could on the Europeans. In hindsight, and obviously hindsight is a much easier thing to apply, I wonder if Cameron would have been better to have followed a Wilson approach and chosen a prominent Eurosceptic perhaps in his cabinet to go and negotiate with the Europeans. Indeed, I wonder how different history might have been if in 2015 David Cameron said to Michael Gove, Michael, I would like you to lead the renegotiations with the European Union, and I would like you to get us a better deal for our terms of membership.
Well, it's very hard to say, but certainly I don't think Gove could have beaten Cameron's energy, matched it perhaps, because this took up a huge amount of time in the year that Cameron was leading a majority government. For me, fundamentally, the issue was that he had promised too much. When he made the Bloomberg speech and when he spoke about it, he would talk about quite fundamental reforms, including reforms to immigration. And then as he was trying to achieve them and falling short, other groups, so Matthew Elliott, when we interviewed him, spoke about Business for Britain, a group that he led. And they were upping the ante, basically, for what they said would be necessary for them as a Eurosceptic group to agree to the new terms. And so the context was always going to be very challenging. I think the big issue that Cameron had really was that a lot of the EU leaders just weren't especially sympathetic to what he was asking for. I don't think a lot of them thought it was that likely that Britain would actually leave the European Union. I think they, put bluntly, had spent quite a long time in which when the EU lost referendums, well, it tried again and it made sure it got the answer that it wanted. It had been decades of expansion from the 6 up to the 28 member states by that time. I think the idea that a country would leave didn't fully register with a lot of them. And I think that was actually a huge mistake on the part of European leaders. We often talk about Britain's blunders and mistakes throughout all of this process. we often omit the fact that when Cameron went there and said, look, I need better terms in order to sell remaining part of this block to my country, most of the EU leaders basically said no to giving him meaningfully better terms. And consequently, the EU lost a fifth of its economic output. It lost its biggest military power, one of its only two nuclear powers. Now, the EU is massively weaker because of Britain's departure. And this is really the moment where the EU leaders, the other 27 heads of government, could have done something about it. You get a sense of Cameron's frustration, as he said at one stage to one of his advisors, frankly, after a day and a half of talks with these people, even I want to leave the EU. I'm getting nowhere. I might have to walk away. I actually think he should have walked away, because the only one among the leaders who was really that sympathetic towards him was Enda Kenny, the Irish Prime Minister. And it's interesting because I think Irish leaders after the vote and after Kenny tended to frame themselves much more pro-EU, anti-Britain in terms of the negotiations. But Kenny's view was basically, Cameron is under a lot of pressure. And he said, quote, let's give him the tools for this fight. And I think Kenny, perhaps in part because of proximity and cultural crossover, and of course, speaking English as well, and probably seeing a lot of the British press as well as the Irish press, understood the pressure that Cameron was under on this issue in a way that people like Angela Merkel, who Cameron depended on really far too much in the negotiations, just didn't.
And in another interesting parallel with the Wilson government, David Cameron takes the decision to suspend collective cabinet and collective ministerial responsibility when it comes to the referendum question of remain or leave. Wilson had done this in 1975. He got a lot of criticism at the time because it was not something that really was done, particularly on a matter of such importance. And it was quite awkward, really, in 1975, because although Harold Wilson was recommending to stay in as Prime Minister and the government that he was leading was recommending that Britain stay in, and indeed, in another parallel with 2016, sent a leaflet to every household in the country telling them this is the government's recommendation and here's why we should stay in. A majority of Labour MPs were leavers. A majority of Labour members were leavers. And the actual official position of the Labour Party was itself to leave the common market. In fact, in 2016, in my house in Cambridge where I was living at the time, I printed off a picture of a 1975 No to Common Market poster, which had been printed by the Labour Party in 1975, and it was a Labour No to Common Market poster, and I put it in my window. But that was an official Labour Party poster at the same time that the Labour government, Her Majesty's government, was recommending to stay in. So it's quite a complex picture.
Well, in one sense, abandoning collective responsibility on such big questions is rather absurd. And it means that the government has a collective view to which all ministers are bound on the question of, say, how much Oxfordshire County Council gets for its road maintenance budget. But it doesn't have a collective view, a common view, on whether or not we're in the European Union or not. And you may say, well, of course, the bigger the issue, the more controversial and divisive it will be. But in some ways, the bigger the issue, the more fundamental it is to the government's view of the country and how the country relates to the world. So in some ways, it's an absurd thing for governments not to have a common view of these issues. The key figure, in some respects, for Cameron deciding to suspend collective responsibility is Chris Grayling, who was the leader of the House of Commons at the time. And he told Cameron quite early on in this process, before the negotiations had concluded, he said, look, I'm probably going to go for leave. And when the broad outline of the renegotiations became known, he said to Cameron, I'm going to declare for leave. There's basically nothing that you're going to achieve that will make me happy. And basically there was a deal. So the deal was that Cameron would suspend collective responsibility if Grayling didn't rush and get involved with the Leave campaign immediately, but waited until after the main summit when the negotiations were expected to conclude. Separate to that, it's worth saying the Conservative Party was officially neutral. It didn't have a position like Labour did in 1975. There is a question of should Cameron have been tougher on his ministers to try and prevent them campaigning for leave. Had he done so, had he basically said, look, this is a government's position, we will vote in cabinet and the majority opinion will be cabinet's opinion and you're all expected to stick to that. Well, fewer people may have got actively involved in the Leave campaign out of fear that they were sacrificing their career prospects. But the alternative could have been several resignations from the cabinet, quite a few resignations from the ministerial ranks, a sense actually that a government was being destabilised, potentially even crippled by this question, as Cameron, a prime minister who didn't really like to move ministers around, let alone lose them, was seeing his authority diminish within the party. So I suspect really what Cameron did was probably the right decision, even if it was ultimately an absurd decision for the reasons I set out. But it was probably the only option available to him. And it is also worth saying, of course, abandoning collective responsibility is not saying, well, do as you like, I hardly care. You know, there was a lot of pressure being put on people to actually get behind the government line and not to break away and campaign for leave.
And this is a bit of a difference from 1975. I feel that in 2016, there was a lot of personal pressure that was put on senior Conservatives to support Remain. There's been a lot of discussion about how basically Michael Gove coming out for leave destroyed Gove's friendship with the Camerons. Whereas in 1975, Mary Wilson, Harold Wilson's wife, happily went into the ballot box and voted leave. Marcia Williams, Marcia Falkender at that point, Lady Falkender, Harold Wilson's chief political advisor, herself was a supporter of leaving, of no. Bernard Donahue, Harold Wilson's chief policy advisor, told me that he wasn't even actually sure if Harold Wilson had voted to stay in the day after the referendum. He had to sort of ask him, did you definitely vote to stay in? And Wilson did confirm that he voted to stay in. But so ambiguous was Wilson's position on this that I just think it felt much more existential for David Cameron than it did for Harold Wilson.
I think the reason for that, though, is that Cameron didn't just try and sit in the background and say, there's this debate to be had, this is what I think, but you make up your own mind. As he said when he resigned the premiership, he fought this campaign, quote, head, heart and soul. He was really, in every respect, the leader of the Remain campaign. So really quite a different context. And of course, arguably, what makes it a little bit different as well is that one of the criticisms that was often made of Cameron is that he ran government with a bit of a chumocracy. He wasn't just colleagues with the people who served around the cabinet table with him. He was very close friends with them as well, which of course can be a benefit at times, but when opinion divides, can inject lots of bitterness into it too.
So let's come on to the Remain campaign, or as it was called, Britain Stronger in Europe. Interesting that they didn't put Remain in their name. Perhaps they ought to have done so. They were led by the businessman, or the chairman. Their chairman was the businessman Stuart Rose, who was the chairman of Marks and Spencer. And I think he was a rather curious choice to be the chairman of the Remain campaign. Matthew Elliott writes in his book that he'd actually met with Stuart Rose before all this happened to get a sense of if Rose might consider supporting Leave. And Elliott says that in that conversation, he left thinking that Stuart Rose was a stronger Eurosceptic than Matthew Elliott. And I have to say that Stuart Rose's interventions in the campaign seemed very half-hearted and somewhat inconsistent and incoherent in the things that he was saying. And then they put as sort of organizational head honcho, the equivalent to Matthew Elliott, Will Straw, who really had very limited successful campaign experience at all. He was a failed parliamentary candidate who'd been involved in a variety of other failed campaigns. It reminded me a bit of when Hillary Clinton that year had Robbie Mook as her campaign manager, even though Mook's career as a strategist had been a series of failed campaigns as well. So all rather curious. My sense of Britain Stronger in Europe is that they took the lessons of the 2014 Scottish referendum and the 2015 general election and thought this whole argument has to be about the risks of the costs to your household finances. George Osborne, the Chancellor, came up with this cooked up number of £4,300, which sounded oddly precise, that every household in the country is going to lose exactly £4,300. I know it was an average, but I think for people it didn't ring especially true. Really, I felt at the time, and I still feel this way, and I know people scoff at this, I felt that people would be willing to take a temporary hit in their household finances, not a massive one, not one of that size, but if they thought, well, there might be some economic hit for leaving, but it would be worth it in order to gain more control over our country and our collective future. And that was a view that Michael Foot, the former Labour leader, took in the 1975 referendum when he was a cabinet minister, one of those cabinet ministers advocating for leave, where he said to a journalist who said to him, if leaving the EEC makes us poorer, would you still support it? And Foot says, I don't see how we can solve our economic problems better by weakening our democratic institutions. And I think that's the core part there, that basically the Remain campaign just didn't understand. They didn't understand that for some people, sovereignty, but not just sovereignty as a concept, but control, power, democratic power over your future is potentially worth more than some hit to your household finance. People actually would be happier to be a bit poorer if they could be a bit freer.
There is now this view that the Remain campaign, Britain Stronger in Europe, was a bad campaign. But I don't think that to lose a referendum is necessarily to have fought it badly. And I actually want to make a slightly unpopular point in defence of the quality of the campaign. Because if we think about what being in the European Union meant, limiting control over the way in which we're governed and the efficacy of what your vote in a general election is able to achieve, uncontrolled immigration from the continent, Britain making a net contribution, whether you use the net figure or the gross figure, we still make a net contribution, and a very significant one, to the European Union every year, funding infrastructure in other European countries and funding the inept bureaucracy that came out of Brussels, giving you an economic and political framework that meant you couldn't, for example, support British businesses in ways that were seen to be unfair compared to European competitors. And all of this being associated with the EU and having to fight a campaign in a country which is actually just much more Eurosceptic, or at least much less European than many countries on the continent. I remember earlier in this year, 2016, visiting some European countries, Germany, the Czech Republic, Austria, and seeing at their national parliaments that alongside their country's flag, they would also have the European Union flag, for example, flying over the Reichstag. And I remember pausing and looking at that and thinking, it's unimaginable for a lot of people, irrespective of which side of the referendum you were on, that we would have the European Union flag flying over the Palace of Westminster. I think even lots of Remainers would have actually instinctively disliked that idea, because it was seen to be a club that we're a member of because we think it's worth being in, and because it brings some benefits to us, not that it fundamentally changes our political identity. So I think in all of that context, I actually find it somewhat amazing that 48% of people voted to Remain at all. And I think it is somewhat to the credit of the Remain campaign and the arguments that they made, which of course, because they lost, are seen as having failed, and quite literally did. But I think the context was actually much worse than sometimes made out. And on its plus side, it was generally competent in terms of its management. It had early fumbles with Stuart Rose, Lord Rose, as you said, but it managed to have cross-party figures within it, broadly singing from the same hymn sheet. I think its message on the economy actually did rather cut through. There was a sense that it would be leaping into the dark economically and would be a bit of an unknown. And so, yes, my key feeling on it really is that we should not conflate losing with being a bad campaign. Actually, you can sometimes have a good campaign that loses. And I think there were strengths of Britain Stronger in Europe.
On the other side of the referendum question, there were warring factions who were competing to get the official designation of being the Leave campaign. We've discussed some of this with Matthew Elliott in our episode with him, and you might want to listen to that if you want to hear about that more in depth. But basically what you have there is an organization called leave.eu, which is funded by a gentleman called Aaron Banks, which is mostly fronted by Nigel Farage and inhabited by supporters of UKIP. And then you have this group, Vote Leave, which is led by Matthew Elliott and Dominic Cummings. It is mostly comprised of Conservatives, but Vote Leave makes a concerted effort to bring in Labour people. They try to bring in the group Labour Leave. They do for some time. Labour Leave then sort of wants to see the two groups come together. That doesn't happen, but they do get Gisela Stewart to become one of the faces of the Vote Leave campaign, which I think is very important. Gisela Stewart being a fairly middle-of-the-road Labour MP, herself being born and brought up in Germany, so she's a German immigrant to Britain, and she's advocating for Britain to leave the EU. And I think that she was a very powerful figure alongside probably the most eloquent of the cabinet ministers on leaving, which was Michael Gove, and the Mayor of London, Boris Johnson. And Johnson stops being mayor in the course of the campaign. In May of 2016, he stands down as Mayor of London. In a way, I think, just as you were saying earlier, Lee, about how we remember these failed or successful campaigns, if Leave had lost, we might have looked back at these divisions as a sign of weakness and said, well, if only Leave.eu and Vote Leave had come together, as people like Kate Hoey from Labour Leave had argued. She was working very hard to try to bring the two together and got very frustrated that they didn't come together. We might say those divisions cost them the vote. The other way you look at it is you say, well, actually, by having these two campaigns, you could have Leave.eu that talked about immigration a great deal, whereas you had with Vote Leave a campaign that first spent a lot of time trying to reassure the public that leaving the EU would not be an economic disaster. And then in the final stages of the campaign, did speak about immigration, but not quite in the same way as Leave.eu. Of course, Vote Leave is most famous for its slogan of, we send £350 million a week to the EU, let's spend that money instead on the NHS, which was put on a bus and in adverts in newspapers and referendum broadcasts and on posters and so on. And of course, that £350 million figure is fiercely contested by Remainers, who point out that's a gross figure, not the net figure if you count in the rebate that we subsequently get after we send the £350 million a week. But what I would say, and this brings us back to our first episode of the Cameron's Referendums miniseries, is that this is clearly learned from the AV referendum. In the 2011 referendum, the No to AV campaign put out these posters saying that electoral reform would cost Britain £250 million, also a contestable figure, but there are ways to argue in favour of that figure. But in those posters, they said, rather than spend the money on electoral reform, let's spend it on hospitals. So it's very clear where they learned that approach from. And people can say it's underhanded and dubious, but at the end of the day, it possibly was quite helpful.
Yes, I think Vote Leave managed to benefit from having these two wings of the Brexit movement, the Nigel Farage side and their side. Although I think the distinction was actually rather less than is sometimes made out. So Matthew Elliott has said elsewhere, not just in our interview, that their approach was to be a non-UKIP cross-party campaign that was targeting swing voters, whereas Aaron Banks, involved with Leave.eu, had basically said that their approach was to do something controversial and then not apologise for it. But actually, that rather becomes the approach of Vote Leave in the actual campaign itself as well. So the £350 million figure was controversial and they didn't apologise for it. All of the stuff that came out towards the end of the campaign about the risk of Turkey joining the European Union, something that was unlikely to happen then and as unlikely still to happen now, that was actually controversial and they didn't apologise for it. So I sometimes think the distinctions that are made between the two campaign sides is somewhat overblown. But what I think is certainly very, very important is that there was a professionalism and a breadth and a dynamism about the people campaigning with Vote Leave that wasn't there with the people involved in Leave.eu. And had Leave.eu got the official designation from the Electoral Commission that they would be the headline campaign group for the Leave cause, then more of those people would have moved over and some of that would have inevitably happened. But I do think that is one of the key decisions on which the referendum was won for Leave, that Vote Leave got the designation. And it's striking that Tim Shipman reports in his book about this campaign, All Out War, that their paperwork to be the official designation was only submitted 20 minutes before the deadline. Had they put that in 21 minutes later, then I actually think that Britain may not have actually voted to leave. In fact, I'm pretty sure that Britain would not have voted to leave the EU. But Richard, if people are to make the argument that there were two distinct approaches on the Leave side, the hallmark of the more aggressive Farage approach is probably one particular poster.
Yes, so this is the breaking point poster, which I think alongside the big Vote Leave battle bus with the £350 million figure on it is the remembered image of this campaign. Nigel Farage unveils the poster. It's a poster depicting a long queue of men, mostly from Afghanistan and Syria, that was taken in Slovenia in the October of 2015, and they were basically being led to a refugee camp. And it got a lot of criticism because these men are not white, and so it was seen as injecting race into the campaign and was mobilizing people to vote Leave on, as the critics would argue, against this poster on racist grounds, that people in Britain didn't want Muslims coming into Britain and that the EU would be a way of doing that. Vote Leave also put out a leaflet which showed a map of Europe and showed then Turkey, which was an official candidate for EU membership. That was accurate, although most people didn't think it was actually going to get EU membership. And the countries that it bordered, including Syria, which people also believed were sort of playing on these fears of mass Muslim migration into Britain. I think there's a lot of validity to those concerns. But what I would say to that is, in 2015, Angela Merkel said, Europe will be open to these refugees. And so it's no surprise that many people from war-torn parts of the world, including Syria and Afghanistan, were coming to Europe. And you might say, well, what does that have to do with Britain's membership of the EU? Well, there was a common program for countries in the EU to accept asylum seekers. And also, if people who are granted asylum eventually settle and gain EU citizenship, then they will have the right to move anywhere in the EU, including Britain. So you could say, well, people shouldn't worry about that and they should welcome that, and diversity is our strength. But not everyone in the country thinks that way. And it was certainly an emotive intervention in the debate, but it was an intervention in the debate that I think was probably fairly well received by quite a number of voters. And it's interesting, Nigel Farage now says that he thinks that poster probably wouldn't get much attention today.
Undoubtedly, that poster struck a chord with some and angered and infuriated others. I think it speaks to the fact that, and this is maybe more grist to the mill for my line, that it's actually remarkable 48% of people voted Remain, that the EU had fundamentally mishandled, in many people's eyes, two big issues, probably the two biggest issues it had to wrestle with in the 2010s. The sovereign debt of many members of the Eurozone, and also the influx of immigration that came after the Arab Spring in 2011 and the destabilising events in the Middle East at the beginning of the decade. And that fed not just into some of the feelings that people felt about Britain's place in Europe, but also contributed to things like the rise of Alternative for Deutschland and other far-right parties on the continent as well. It wasn't just a feature of this campaign. Immigration had salience, though, throughout. We began this episode by talking about immigration and how that contributed to how people thought about these issues. And about 4 weeks before the vote, on the 26th of May, the new immigration stats for 2015 were published. And they were higher than every year so far that Cameron had been in office. Net 330,000. And again, important to say, Cameron had promised in his manifesto to be below 100,000 in the tens of thousands. And so towards the end of that campaign, the Breaking Point poster really sought to put immigration back front and centre, except something else then dominated the headlines. And it's something which I think is an appalling act that we've never really actually confronted the reality of the fact that it happened in our political system, and that it's such a low point in the history of our country, not just in this referendum campaign. And that's the assassination of Joe Cox.
And that, in fact, happened the very same day that Nigel Farage unveiled the Breaking Point poster, the 16th of June, 2016. So Jo Cox was doing work in her constituency that day. She was holding a surgery, which is, for those who are not British, that's a meeting that members of parliament have with members of the public who come with their problems, and the member tries to help them with their casework concerns. And outside of where she was holding her constituency surgery, a far-right, fascist, evil person came up and stabbed Jo Cox, the Labour MP, to death. And it was a really awful and tragic thing to happen. As you say, Lee, Jo Cox was a newly elected Labour MP. She was only elected the year before. She was a young mother. This man took the mother away of two small children. And at that, I remember when I heard it, first of all, it is one of those times where I do remember where I was when I heard about this news. I remember shock and disbelief. I thought it must have been misreporting or something like that. But of course, it was also in the midst of this referendum. It's the 16th of June. The referendum is on the 23rd of June. It's this huge, heightened political event. And so, of course, naturally, one would also think, what would this mean for the referendum? And my view was that, well, that was it. I thought that Leave would lose the referendum. I felt there would be a significant proportion of people who would believe that Jo Cox was killed for being a Remainer, and they wouldn't want to be seen as being on the side of someone who would kill an MP for her political beliefs. And in a way, I think it's understandable that people might have felt that way, although, of course, I think it turned out that wasn't actually that widespread a thing. But what I think it did mean for the purposes of the campaign, and of course it does feel a little bit unseemly to talk about it in the purpose of the campaign, but that's what this episode is about, it jutted things a bit to a halt. Campaigning was paused for a period where people were allowed to grieve, to show their respects to Jo Cox. The different party leaders went up to Batley, where she was the MP, to be there and to show their condolences and to lay flowers at the site where she was murdered. I think also it affected the campaigns, particularly actually I think the Remain campaign. I don't know this, but I do wonder if it caused the Remain campaign to take their foot off the pedal a little bit and perhaps to pull back, maybe because they thought they would win, not because they were happy that this would lead to them winning, of course not, but maybe they did think, for similar reasons that I felt, that actually in this context, how could Leave win? And so we know that Remain did not deploy some of its most impactful interventions in the final week of the campaign when it could have, including that the governor of the Bank of England, a chap called Mark Carney, who now has another job, I gather, would come out for Remain, and that you'd have people like Christine Lagarde from the IMF come out for Remain, and not just come out for Remain, but argue that if Britain voted to leave the EU, then it would lead to economic catastrophe. And in the end, the Remain campaign didn't do that after the killing of Jo Cox, and I wonder whether that was a mistake. So one final comparison between the 75 referendum and the 2016 referendum is on the eve, or almost the eve, the 21st of June in 2016, there is a big televised debate. In 1975, it was held in the Oxford Union between, on the pro-European side, the former Conservative Prime Minister Edward Heath, the Liberal leader and dog killer Jeremy Thorpe, and on the Leave side, the outside, you had the wonderful cabinet ministers in the Labour government, Barbara Castle and Peter Shaw. And it's one of the great political debates in British history, and it was televised throughout the country. And you still hear older people say they remember that debate and what an impact it had. In 2016, this was the big debate. On the Remain side, you had Francis O'Grady, who was chair of the TUC, Ruth Davidson, Scottish Tory leader, and Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London. And then on the Leave side, you had Andrea Leadsom, Gisela Stewart, and Boris Johnson. I don't want to be unkind to these individuals. Some are very distinguished political figures, and some are very good debaters and so on. I don't think the BBC debate 2016 quite met the standards of debate that were seen in the Oxford Union in that BBC debate in 1975.
What their campaigns are doing is doing something which is rational in and of itself, but actually it's a big picture, I think, rather cheapens their message. And you see this all the time. So actually, if you watch any of this 2016 debate, and I don't necessarily encourage it, almost everybody on the Leave side is saying over and over again the three-word mantra of the campaign: take back control. And that's because modern communication in politics is all about message discipline, get your message across. People won't be watching all that much. They won't take in the big arguments. But actually, what does that add up to in the end? Really just a cheap and uninspiring form of soundbite politics. And I don't say that just of the Leave campaign, of the Remain campaign, because all politics, for the most part, has ended up becoming that. And whilst it may end up being professionally smart and rational in one sense, it ends up being deeply inauthentic and actually communicates really a sense of politics, which people are right to feel is worse than it was 50 years ago. Because it's not necessarily that the people are worse. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. We could debate that. But I think the style of communicating, as it's become more narrowly fixated on message discipline and communicating sound bites, is definitely worse. It's very hard to imagine Ted Heath just repeating a soundbite over and over again. In fact, I've got a feeling he'd say no if you asked him, and that's to his credit.
Well, on the 23rd of June 2016, in the largest vote in the country's history, with 33.5 million people voting, 17.4 million vote for Leave and 16.1 million vote Remain. And I think it was a seismic, indeed somewhat shocking result. I have to say, as someone who voted Leave in what happened to be, I think, the most pro-Remain ward in the country, central Cambridge, I wasn't expecting Leave to win. I'd hoped Leave would win, but I wasn't expecting Leave to win. I think it took most people, most commentators, probably most voters, or many voters at least, by surprise.
Well, the whole night was a bit of a roller coaster, really, because it started with seemingly the key figures in the Leave campaign conceding. Farage basically said, we think we've fallen short. Boris Johnson was on the tube and apparently said the same thing to somebody. They then told the press, Gove assumes defeat, it's also said. And Jim Messina, the Obama campaign specialist, who was working for the Remain campaign, apparently even took a call from somebody senior in the Vote Leave campaign, conceding that it was lost. But it was really based on nothing to a very large degree, except, I think, this deep-seated feeling that almost irrespective of what the polls said, it was very hard to imagine a Leave win. I mean, the polls were very close. Referendums are unpredictable. Every vote that's off one campaign is a vote on another. You don't necessarily need all that many people flipping from one side to another for that to change the outcome, certainly very often within the margin of error for polls too.
I think there was this sort of received wisdom that when you had a choice like that, the change side needed to be much further ahead because the undecided voters would typically break for the status quo option. I think that was, I sort of remember talking about it in those terms at the time.
Yes, I'm sure that's right. But certainly there was a lot of nervousness in number 10, although among some a quiet confidence. David Cameron was on a laptop in Downing Street. Some of his staff said it's the first time they'd ever seen him on a laptop. One of those things where somebody who was once the future and the young person of British politics somewhat actually seems rather behind the curve in that sense. But They were basically looking at a spreadsheet where you would insert the results and it would say, based on how they thought that local authority was expected to vote, what the overall picture was going to look like. And by just the 10th council result, the model that they were using in Downing Street predicted that the result would be 52-48 to leave the European Union. Early the next morning, when that result was confirmed, in effect, David Cameron's career was at its end.
I think it's worth reflecting both sides were massive cross-party, cross-society coalitions. The Leave vote, 17.4 million, is the largest electoral coalition ever assembled in the history of this country.
It's maybe just worth saying as well, the 16.1 million who voted Remain is the second biggest, right? I mean, these are huge numbers.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so they contain within them, and believe me, people are very quick to parody on both sides what the modal leaver looks like and the modal Remainer looks like. And of course, there are some groups that are more highly represented in one segment than the other. But I think we've got to remember that, places that have large ethnic minority communities like Luton and Slough voted to leave the EU. 1 in 3 people who voted for Ed Miliband to become Prime Minister in the previous year's general election voted to leave the EU. And a high proportion of Conservatives actually voted to remain in the EU. So although I think in the years after, the debate became more and more polarized, and voters, I think, sorted themselves more and more into these kind of tribes that mapped onto all these other social identities. It was a remarkable achievement, actually, on both sides. I think you're right to say that, Lee, to assemble these coalitions that, on the Leave side, spanned Dennis Skinner, the left-wing Labour MP, right up to Jacob Rees-Mogg, right-wing Conservative MP.
There is so much more we could say on this, so much more perhaps that we should have said on this. But if you wanted to remember more about this referendum or learn more about it if you don't know much so far, I would recommend a book that, in fact, I'm sure is on many listeners' shelves, which is All Out War by Tim Shipman. This was published in 2017, and it's really a blow-by-blow account of how we got to the referendum result and then the immediate fallout, actually, afterwards, and the leadership struggles that followed. Sometimes people can be quite sniffy about this book and say that it's basically journalism, but actually good journalism is a very noble thing. And it's certainly, if it is journalism, it's very good. And it's gripping throughout. It includes a lot of detail, which when you remember recent history or history that you've lived through with broad brushstrokes, this contains a lot of detail that certainly when I was going back through it in the last couple of days, I'd forgotten from when I lived through these events or read this book. It's the first in the quartet of books that Shipman wrote about, give or take, 10 years in British politics. And in my view, it is the best because the issues become much more fundamental quite often, and the drama is so much more intense than, say, when we're thinking about what was the Chequers deal and that Theresa May was negotiating these variations of backstops, etc. Recalling that history can just be stodgy and detailed. This is unfailingly dramatic, and I think Shipman recounts it all very well.
Well, my book this week is Adults in the Room, My Battle with Europe's Deep Establishment by Yanis Varoufakis. I can remember the night of the referendum result quite clearly, and one of my enduring memories is that when Leave won, I got a phone call from a friend of mine who is a British academic of Greek heritage, who was in Greece at the time, who rang up, I think he was in a nightclub in Greece, shouting down the phone, "We've won, we've won, we've won." And for many of us on the left who were Eurosceptic, and I should say this gentleman at the time was a Labour councillor, who were Leavers, we were horrified at the treatment of Greece during the Eurozone crisis and how the EU countries basically stripped away Greece's ability to determine its own future, certainly to elect governments that could pursue the socialist policies that that government wanted to pursue. And Yanis Varoufakis' book details the struggles that he had as the finance minister in the Syriza government, which was elected on a kind of left, quasi-Eurosceptic, not a leaver position, but certainly one that wanted to ensure that Greece had its own ability to set its own sovereign future. And yet the way in which countries like Germany in particular basically stripped Greece of its autonomy when it came to its economic policies. It is a very eye-opening, blow-by-blow account of Varoufakis' struggles. And as you read the book, you feel frustrated for him. And every time he tries a new tactic and he runs up against another barrier put up to him by the boys in EU blue.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode and this mini-series. If you've enjoyed listening to the podcast, we'd be delighted if you left us a positive review wherever you get your podcast from. And if you'd like to hear more from us and support the show, then you can always join our Patreon, where you can listen ad-free and hear some bonus episodes as well. Otherwise, we'll be back on Thursday, in which, as we're approaching 250 years since America's Declaration of Independence, Richard, who, when he's not doing this, is a senior lecturer in US politics, will be reflecting on America at 250. He'll see you then.
Thanks very much.